Good afternoon. My name is Jim Carlton. I'm with the Association of Migraine Disorders, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Hot Topics in Migraine panel discussion, sponsored by the Association of Migraine Disorders. This afternoon, we have a number of esteemed guests with us. They're going to be speaking on a variety of subjects. First on our list is Dr. Robert Shapiro, who's going to be talking about the fight for migraine funding at the far left in the number one poll position here. Dr. Shapiro is a researcher and veteran organizer of Headache on the Hill, which is a leading long-term strategy to protect and increase federal funding of migraine research. He emphasizes the value of studying pain pathways as a method to improve outcomes from head trauma and to develop alternatives to opioids for pain relief. He's going to discuss current political landscape for pain research. Okay. Number two, immediate to my left, is Dr. Brian McGeeney, who's going to be talking about the pros and cons of marijuana or cannabinoids for pain control. Dr. McGeeney is a well-recognized academic, neurologist, and researcher who is expert in the evaluation, especially of alternative therapies for pain control and their alleged scientific validity. He also has been involved in evaluating the value of cannabinoids in pain control, and he will share his always pointed opinions on this subject with us today. And number three, to Dr. McGeeney's left, we have Dr. Ann St. Gore, who is going to be talking about can MDMA play a part in migraine relief? For those of you that aren't sure or don't know, MDMA is short for 3,4-methylene dioxyl methamphetamine. MDMA, also known as ecstasy or mollies. So this is a drug that is relatively controversial, but Dr. St. Gore retired from her Boston-based internal medical practice and dove immediately into the subject of MDMA for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. She's recently completed her certification in this area, and she's going to share her information and her thoughts on this really interesting and cutting-edge subject. Okay, and finally, number four, immediately to Dr. St. Gore's left, is Dr. Richard Bowles, who's going to speak on the promise of Avantra genetic tests for migraine. Dr. Bowles is the medical director of Cortigen and its subsidiary Avantra. Dr. Bowles' research focus is on the genetic changes in genes involved in energy metabolism and more recently on ion channels and their effects on common functional disorders such as migraine. Dr. Bowles' mission in joining Cortigen recently is to facilitate the vast amounts of acquired genetic knowledge into applications that inform routine medical care. Under his leadership, Avantra uses next-generation sequencing to provide custom reports interpreted by geneticists to assist physicians in making the best-informed treatment recommendations. Those are our four present. Dr. Lynn Griffiths is probably, hopefully, en route, and she will be speaking on the new reality of genetic screening. And when she gets here, we can give a little more of an introduction, but she's the last one on our list, so we can get going with Dr. Shapiro.
So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a real honor to be here. This is a fantastic organization, and it's a great event. And I'm going to speak today about the need for increased research related to migraine and other headache disorders. And there really is a huge disparity, a huge deficiency in the amount of available funds for understanding migraine and for actually coming up with leads towards new therapies. I'm principally going to be talking about federal funding for research. There are a handful of critical sources for pilot grants. This organization, the Association of Migraine Disorders and the Migraine Research Foundation, have been heroically funding small grants for some time. But really the big pot of money that we need, the big mountain that we need to move is the federal mountain. So there really is insufficient money for migraine research, and insufficient relative to what? Relative to how much we would all want, which is a relatively large sum. But I think the best way to think about it is relative to the burden that migraine imposes. And when people talk about burden, in this context, they're typically talking about either how many people have it, how many people die from it, how much disability it causes, how much it costs. And these are all different ways of measuring burden. And by every one of these measures, except perhaps fatalities, migraine is grossly underfunded. So how do we look at this? So the principal burden for migraine really is disability. And we're trying to align migraine funding with how much that burden is. So for the last decade, we've gone to Washington each year in the late winter when it's cold, but it's an important time from the standpoint of trying to influence legislators. And this was our group this year. In February, we had 93 people from 33 states. A number of people in this room were there. And we visited 158 offices. And every year we try to move the issue a little bit further along. And this year I think we're making some progress. So what's the big problem? The disability problem can be shown here. So everything you see in green is related to the disability of migraine relative to all the other diseases that are within the neurology realm. So this includes stroke and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and epilepsy and MS. And what you see is migraine, which is the light green, and medication overuse headache, which is the darker green at the bottom, collectively are more than half of all the disability that's caused by neurological diseases. It's grossly underestimated and underappreciated. Everyone knows about the enormous and growing burden of Alzheimer's disease, but people don't recognize that the considerable burden on people of childbearing age, people in the workforce, is largely related to migraine. So migraine is the leading cause of disability for Americans under the age of 50. So how do we look at migraine funding relative to this burden? So another way to look at burden is to say, okay, how much is the disability and how many people die from it and how many people have it? And there's a composite number which the World Health Organization has come up with called the disability adjusted life year, or DALY. You don't really need to know exactly how that sausage is created, but every disease is assigned essentially a burden on the basis of this. And if you look at the burden, which is down here on this axis, versus NIH funding, you can see that for the 68 different disorders that the NIH has analyzed, which were the complete list that they had data, that there's a relationship between how much the burden is, okay, in this axis, versus how much the funding is. And there really is a line that can be drawn which approximates the predicted funding if all things were being equal relative to funding and burden. Of course, there are other reasons why funding ends up coming towards diseases. You know, you have to worry about diseases which are emerging, like Ebola. You have to recognize that when there's a particular breakthrough, funding needs to follow that to try to capitalize on that. But overall, there really is a relationship between the amount of funding and the amount of burden. And what you also see is that lying here at the bottom, okay, the furthest away from this line, which would be drawn here, are migraine and headaches. They are absolutely the most underfunded major disorders in the entire realm that the NIH has to look at. And where should it be? You know, if you were to look at a disorder which has approximately the same burden as migraine, you would look at schizophrenia, which is up here, and it turns out schizophrenia sits almost directly on that predicted funding line. So how much funding does schizophrenia get as a predicted number relative to migraine? It's 14 times more, okay? 14 times more to get to the point where you're at the predicted line relative to the entire universe of disorders which the NIH funds. So this is a view of the NIH data. These are the data that the NIH have presented about how much funding they've made available, or not made available, how much funding of grants that they've funded are related to migraine and headache disorders. And you can see initially when we got our advocacy efforts going, there was a notable increase, and we were feeling pretty good about ourselves, even though we probably weren't responsible for this. But nonetheless, things really stalled around 2014. And with the current president's budget, there's a predicted 20% drop in migraine research funding in 2018, assuming that the president's budget is fully enacted. This is a major crisis if this were to occur. But another thing happened in this time frame, which really, I think, points out how we might frame or think about the search for more migraine research funding, and that's the opioid crisis. So the opioid crisis was not a random event. It didn't just kind of happen. It was promoted by criminal marketing of particular pharmaceuticals. And this lit the match, and we have been suffering from this ever since. And you have to ask, these prescription opioids, they were prescribed for something. They were prescribed for pain disorders. And it's not uncommon for people who have migraine to be prescribed opioids. They're typically ineffective for migraine, and they often make the problem worse, but nonetheless, it's a common problem both in emergency departments and among primary care providers. So in recognition of this, in recognition of the idea that if research had come up with remedies for pain, including pain disorders such as migraine, which rendered opioids obsolete, this match might never have been lit back in 1996. So this is pain research funding by the NIH, and you can see it's essentially been flat for as long as that they've been reporting these numbers, except for this projected 20% fall if the president's budget's enacted. And is that enough? Let's think in terms of amount of pain research funding versus its burden. The World Health Organization doesn't have a little dot on that scatter chart for pain, but we can ask, relative to what we know and has been calculated for the cost of pain, chronic pain in the United States, we can compare that to other disorders. And what we see is this: pain by far, it's absolutely incomparable, by far is the most costly single health problem we have, and migraine is bundled into that. It's the only disorder where you have to think in terms of major fractions of $1 trillion a year. This $600 billion amount for pain is undoubtedly an underestimate. There are all sorts of other sources of costs for pain, for instance, people in prisons and in the military, et cetera, which are not calculated in this. So if you add up the cost of heart disease and cancer combined, it's less than the cost of pain each year. And relative to the amount of NIH funding, how much funding comes to pain? You saw in the previous slide that it's about $500 million a year, which is a huge amount of money, but is it enough relative to its burden? What we see is that cancer, relative to its costs, is about 30 times more funded than pain. So what have we been working to do about this? Well, fortunately, we have some great allies in Congress. Last year, and you'll hear a little bit more about this when I introduce Senator Whitehouse, there was a critical piece of legislation to help combat the opioid crisis called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, or CARA, C-A-R-A. And with the wonderful and huge efforts of Senator Schatz and Senator Hatch, we were able to help include in that bill this piece of legislation, these provisions, which direct NIH to focus on increasing pain research to find leads towards new remedies which are not addictive. And in particular, in here, it's mentioned that the relative burdens of individual diseases and medical disorders be regarded as crucial considerations in balancing the priorities of the federal research portfolio. Now, since migraine is on that map as being the most underfunded disease relative to burden, we believe that this legislation, should it be fully funded, will lift all the boats, including migraine research. Included in that is this language, which came out in last year's appropriations bill, which specifically directs NIH to focus on the burden of disease, okay, setting priorities of the burden of disease. And the Appropriations Committee supports a focus on conditions in need of further funding, such as chronic pain, including migraine, and other treatment alternatives for chronic pain. So Congress is focused on this, and it's time to actually make some progress with it. So here's some recent developments. By recent, I mean in the last month, things that we should all be excited about, which suggest that there may be some important movement, despite all of the headlines, all the things you read on the front page or the first thing that comes up on Google News. So some of these are a little arcane, but they're really important. So in May, the NIH established a specific group, a study section, to review migraine research grants and pain research grants. This is the first time it's been possible to have a relatively level playing field for grants to be reviewed at NIH. The NIH Director Collins and National Institute of Drug Abuse Director Nora Volkow wrote an important piece in the New England Journal that came out on June 1st, which says, "We cannot hope to prevent opioid misuse and overdose without addressing the treatment needs of people with moderate to severe chronic pain." So this is the most important voices at NIH linking this issue of opioid abuse and the opioid crisis with the pain crisis. Further, on June 7th, 73 organizations, including this organization, co-signed a letter to Governor Christie, who is leading the President's Commission on combating drug addiction and opioid crisis, and states, "A long-term solution to the opioid crisis will only be achieved by addressing inadequately treated pain." So there's consistency here. Furthermore, Matt Gold, who is a colleague and friend, who is a delegate at the American Medical Association, was able to get the American Medical Association to resolve this year, this particular resolution, that our AMA advocate for current legislation that will increase funding for basic and translational pain research. On June 15th, at a congressional briefing, the neurology director, Director Koroshetz, recognized this issue about the underfunding of migraine research and headache research by saying, actually, the worst is headache, the biggest disparity between the prevalence and the amount of NIH money that goes in. So they're aware of this. Finally, only yesterday, before the Health Appropriations Committee, Senator Blunt, who is the chair of that subcommittee, which actually has jurisdiction over the NIH budget, indicated that they intend to not actually make these cuts. This is remarkably welcome news. So the President's budget proposes NIH cuts that, rest assured, the committee will find unacceptable. And then I think the most exciting thing is yet to come, which is that Senator Schatz and my Congressman, Peter Welch, we have drafted legislation, it hasn't yet been introduced, to actually create a Stop Pain initiative. You've heard about perhaps heard about precision medicine and the cancer moonshot. These were innovation projects in this big piece of legislation last year. Well, they're proposing a new large piece of legislation focused on pain. And the first bit of that will be $100 million for next year if it comes about. So with that, thanks very much.
And so to put things in perspective, the science on medical marijuana for pain only started in the 1970s, and that was a very basic science. And in 1996, the first state in the United States had medical marijuana, and that was California. And we now have, as I think most of you know, about 30 states, and the majority of the population live in states which have medical marijuana laws. Unfortunately, they all seem to be a little different in what they're allowing and what they're not allowing. And so after it suffered, the issue of marijuana suffered from a lot of stigma. Historically, due to associations with racial groups and culture, unfortunately. And these days, when I listen to politicians, I still worry that when they say those folks are good people, don't smoke marijuana, it's still a those people, we're not those people, and that's really harmful. To fast forward a bit, with the opening up of the laws, we finally have the opportunity for more science. A common criticism is, where is the science? And the answer is, we do have some. We have good clinical studies, unfortunately of small numbers, but it's wrong to say we have no science, and it's wrong to say we have no evidence for the treatment of pain. We do, in fact. Just for instance, the symptoms of spasticity in multiple sclerosis, the American Academy of Neurology say level A evidence based on 2 randomized control studies. We have studies on various neuropathic pains. We don't have studies on headaches, believe it or not. All we have is case studies, case series. So we really don't know. But that doesn't stop us having hypotheses. And we saw earlier, Dr. Shapiro had the graph about the opioid deaths. And one wonders that if there was more of an availability with medical marijuana and cannabis, whether we'd really have such a high and increasing death rate. The JAMA, one of the most prestigious medical journals, published in October 2014 a very interesting paper looking at the death rate of opioids in the year after the introduction of medical marijuana. And remember, that was staggered. It didn't just happen at once. And all those states, the opioid deaths fell by as much as 20%. Now, this is just an association. That doesn't automatically mean causation, but it gets you to wonder, and it might very well be causation, that if you have greater access to a safer agent, that you're not going to have as many opioid deaths. Now, that's just a hypothesis, but it's an intriguing one, and it's a one can back up with some evidence. Part of my role, I feel, is as a certifier for medical marijuana, is to educate other practitioners into how to counsel patients. If the practitioners don't know much about it, they're hardly going to be able to counsel patients on the pros and cons for those who have pain. And there's a lot more. As a physician, I never advocate smoking anything, but there are other inhalational routes and oral routes that are far healthier. And I think as physicians, we should all be pushing for that. And let's face it, when you look at the mature markets with medical marijuana, up to 95% is for pain primarily. So even though they may say it's for my spasticity, it's for this, that, and the other, it's even certain diseases, often the biggest symptom of those diseases is pain. And unfortunately, some states don't even recognize that as a legitimate reason for certifying somebody for medical marijuana. And that's, I think, probably because of the politicians, and we need to take the politicians out of the indications and out of medicine, probably in general. And that's one of the problems. I mean, New York, for instance, has very restrictive laws on what you can prescribe for, and pain isn't one of them, I don't think, or even nausea, another very common one. If you had those symptoms, the symptomatic indications, even if you don't have migraine listed, for instance, or headache disorders, it comes under the rubric of pain or nausea. And the science is coming, and for those of you who look at the journals, just about 2 weeks ago, the New England Journal published a pivotal study on the use of cannabidiol, a non-psychoactive agent. Well, it will not make you high. It has no street value to treat successfully seizures in children with refractory seizure disorders, specifically Dravet's, and it's in phase 3 for multiple other childhood seizure disorders. So it's a powerful agent. And I'm not talking about an agent that makes you goofy. This is an agent which appears to have many actions that won't make you dopey or dizzy. And which brings me to, I often hear the criticism, well, we already have the active ingredient THC. There is a medication you can prescribe for years, and it is indicated for anorexia of chemotherapy or the weight loss in association with cancer or HIV. There are 2 products, in fact. One is Schedule 2, one is Schedule 3. They're synthetic THC. But this is pure THC, and it turns out, and from my clinical experience, the pure THC doesn't work so well as an anti-pain agent. It turns out that the plant itself has many dozens of cannabinoids, a lot of which are present in a material amount to have a biologic effect. And it appears to be the entourage effect. So this group effect that appears to be more beneficial for the treatment of most symptoms. Now, can I back that up with a lot of science? No, but that appears to be the case. And that's the overwhelming hypothesis. And I look forward to the question and answer session. I won't sap too much more of your time for this very big topic, but I encourage you to bring up any particular topics with respect to marijuana or cannabis. Maybe I should be saying more cannabis is a more maybe medical term now, in connection with the treatment in pain disorders specifically. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you to cousin Rick. Full disclosure, Rick is my cousin, and I really pushed him on whether he wanted me here because I don't know a whole lot about migraines, so I feel really excited and honored to be here. So thank you. So as Jim mentioned, I was a primary care doctor for 30 years, and in that role, I didn't do a whole lot of public speaking. I was usually one-on-one with someone and that other person didn't have their clothes on. So this is a new role for me, and I'm excited to be doing it because I'm very passionate about the topic. So I've been working with a nonprofit called MAPS, which stands for the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And we are about to embark on an FDA-approved phase 3 study looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. This is the getting close. We hope 3 years, maybe the medicine will become legal. And I'll be one of the therapists doing the work in the Boston area. So as Jim mentioned, it's the purported ingredient of recreational ecstasy and Molly. When you test the street drugs, they almost never are pure MDMA. It was used when it was legal in the mid-70s to 1985 when it became a Controlled One substance by an estimated 4,000 therapists. And they used it to treat couples for PTSD, for anxiety, and for addiction. And there are many anecdotal articles in the literature talking about how efficacious it was, but there was no controlled research done during that era. It increases the levels of the feel-good hormones, so serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine. It decreases the fear response and increases empathy for and trust of self and others. There are transient mild increases of blood pressure, heart rate, and temperature in most people. The toxicity in the recreational users is related to polydrug use, unknown drug use, and also the setting where the drugs are taken. There have been over 1,100 individuals who've received MDMA in the MAPS-sponsored phase 1 and phase 2 studies, and we have had no unexpected drug-related serious adverse events. There's also been neuropsych testing pre and post 2 MDMA sessions, and there's been no evidence of any cognitive impairment. So what is the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research? The participants have severe PTSD as measured by the CAP score, which is the clinician-administered PTSD score. They're vets, they're first responders like firemen and policemen, and survivors of sexual assault. The cause of the PTSD does not matter for this treatment. They have to be off all their psych meds and clean and sober for about 6 months before they enter the research. Participants are randomly assigned to get MDMA or a placebo. They get the psychotherapy regardless of what they get. The first step is they meet with a male and female therapy team, and the 3 of them meet twice to develop a rapport and trust. And then they head into the MDMA sessions. There are 3 sessions a month apart. The sessions last 6 to 8 hours. During this, the therapists are with them the whole time. Some of the time during the sessions, the participants have eye shades on and are listening to music and are doing internal processing. Some of the time they're talking with the therapist, processing whatever's coming up. The day after the MDMA session, they have an hour-and-a-half psychotherapy session with the therapist to process and consolidate whatever they've learned from their experience. They then have weekly psychotherapy sessions, again with the male-female pair, in between the MDMA sessions, one after the last session and one 6 months after the final session. Those who receive the placebo are then offered the exact same protocol again with MDMA. There are independent raters who are evaluating the participants pre, during, and post the study. The first phase 2 MDMA-sponsored clinical trial of 20 participants showed that 83% of those who received MDMA no longer had PTSD versus 25% of those who received the placebo. I'd like to repeat that because it's amazing. The first phase 2 clinical trial of 20 participants showed that 83% of those who received MDMA, these are people with crippling PTSD, no longer had PTSD, versus 25% of those who received a placebo. Done long-term follow-up over an average of 4 years, and that has shown that roughly 75% of the participants still have significant improvement. So this is a lasting change. It reconfigures how the brain works. The data for the other phase 2 studies is still being analyzed and prepared for publication, and the numbers are in the same range. So how and why does this work? Sounds like magic, doesn't it? So the mechanism of action is thought to be a decrease in avoidance and defensiveness with a clearer memory of past events and a willingness and an ability to process them. There's a new awareness in the participants of their counterproductive patterns of emotional and cognitive response to trauma. They also have a stronger therapeutic alliance with their therapist, and they have a prolonged time for processing. The MDMA doesn't make looking at trauma easy, but it makes it possible, and people are encouraged to look at their trauma. When they look at the trauma, they can look at it and say, that was then, and this is now. I'm safe now. I'm not going to get re-triggered by the past events. And so that is the repatterning that happens in the brain. And that gets rid of the hypervigilance, which is so crippling for people with PTSD. They live in an adrenaline bath all the time, so if we can break that cycle, they can then function. Also, functional MRIs done after the MDMA sessions have showed decreased activity in the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are the areas of the brain of memory and fear, when they're compared with functional MRIs done before the MDMA sessions. So, can MDMA play a part in migraine relief? We hope so. There's no research to answer this question yet. So we believe that MDMA can help trauma and stress. So how do we link migraines to trauma and stress? Anxiety and depression are well known to be associated with migraines, and stress is a known trigger for the migraines. The hypothesis that many of our somatic and psychological illnesses are linked to trauma and stress is well described in Gabor Mate's 2003 book called When the Body Says No, and again in Bessel van der Kolk's recent bestseller book on the Science New York Times list called The Body Keeps the Score. Migraines are mentioned in both of those books. So perhaps MDMA could minimize the stress of having migraines and thereby lessen the severity and the frequency of the migrainous episodes. So I'd like to conclude by reading a firsthand report of one of the participants in one of the MAP studies using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people who have anxiety related to life-threatening illnesses. This gentleman had crippling scleroderma, which is a tightening of the skin. He'd been an athlete and he could not move his body because of the scleroderma. He was treating the symptom with large doses of opioids, and that got him through the day, but it was hard for him to function that way. He heard about the study, tapered himself off the opiates, and then had 2 sessions with the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And this is what he says. And I'll try not to cry, because I get really emotional reading these. It's been 1 year since concluding my part in the study. Through many different means, I am physically about 90% better. A large part of improving physically is to make gains emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, especially when living with an incurable, life-threatening illness, or we could say a crippling illness like migraines. Back to him. When you get your internal house in order, learn to entertain only the truth in your thoughts, learn the medicinal value of crying, Learn to tap into the gigantic pool of empathy that exists as a counterpoint to the loneliness, fear, and anger that is the human condition. Your life changes for the better. He continues, my involvement in the MAP-sponsored study was the pivotal event that helped me get in touch with this and reclaim my life. The study enabled me to wake up, pause, and tap into love and courage. I run on trails, beaches, and I do half marathons again. I became certified to teach aerial yoga, and I enjoy a new line of work in answer to a calling to help others. Unquote. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could also treat migraine sufferers with this revolutionary therapy? Let's see if we could help them. Thank you.
I'm the medical director of Cortigen and Avantra Genetics, but this is a new phase of my life. Previous to that, I was at Children's Hospital Los Angeles as a pediatrician and a geneticist. I was there for 20 years, faculty at USC, doing research in mostly in cyclic vomiting syndrome and other types of, which is not that rare type of migraine that a lot of people have not heard about before. Still not on there. Okay. So I'm just going to go through it, and hopefully it'll get in there at certain points. One of the slides, if you were able to see it, which you can't, is there's the proverb from India about the elephant, and that there's a bunch of blind men, and they're all filling different parts of the elephant. One fills the trunk, and one fills the tail, and one fills the body, and they're filling 3 different animals in what they describe it as. And then there's I mean, to some degree, that's with a lot of the patients. There are certainly a lot of patients that just have migraine, but there are many patients that have migraine that have other things as well, in particular chronic fatigue. Many of them have irritable bowel or POTS, which is where you get dizzy and you might faint when you stand up. The cyclic vomiting, complex regional pain syndrome, seizure disorders, and there's interstitial cystitis, which you feel like you always have to urinate even after you emptied your bladder. And there's many, many others of these functional conditions, in particular just functional nausea or abdominal pain as well. And these seem to run in families, and that while one person may have migraine, their sister may have irritable bowel, tinnitus or ringing in the ears, a mother may have depression, a brother may have chronic fatigue syndrome, somebody else may have complex regional pain syndrome, and then once in a while there's relatives that have multiple of these at the same time. And so the disability of each condition sort of works on top of each other, and some of these individuals have a lot of problems. The first case report I wanted to talk about is a teenage girl. Oh, you got it. Oh, not?
Back up out, it just has to go, Will, are you here?
All right. Okay.
It's looking for a signal, so you probably want to go on.
All right.
We're not going to be able to do that?
It's on here.
Okay. Well, we have that, so it's just push it.
Sorry. Okay, we're just gonna.
There's something wrong with the cord, I think.
It was working before. Okay. Peyton is a girl that had, for 10 years, she had episodes of cyclic vomiting in which she would have extremely disabling nausea, as well as vomiting and lethargy that would last for a week. Often be hospitalized for a week, and then for 3 weeks she'd be a completely normal girl, and then she'd vomit for another week. And that went on for the first 10 years of her life. At around the time of puberty, it morphed to migraine, which it is often to do. And then for a couple of years, she had a migraine that never went away. I mean, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, she had an 8 or 9 out of 10 pain. And that's when I started to see her. She also had fatigue, and she had multiple bowel cleanouts for very severe constipation. We did, and that was at the very beginning of genetic testing and everything. We did a very large number of genes, sequenced several thousand genes. It found that there was a variant in a chaperone, or a protein which protects the antioxidant proteins in the mitochondria. Based upon that, we put her on antioxidant. She got a little bit better. But then on molecular modeling in a three-dimensional computer basis, we were able to look at the mutation and say which of all of the chemicals that are available will turn off the mutant protein but leave on the wild type protein, because she has one mutation on one allele from one parent and the other one's normal. And found a drug, Kytril, which is actually used very commonly in chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Gave her on Kytril, and the pain went away completely. 100% went away. Her nausea, also her dizziness, and fatigue and GI problems got a lot better as well. But so she went from being completely disabled, not able to leave the house, hardly able to go downstairs, to be able to go to school full time. So I mean, that shows you, what you can do with genetic testing. Another patient was normal until he was about 21 years old, and then he started to develop severe abdominal pain and had a diagnosis of abdominal migraine. He meets criteria for that. He would come into emergency rooms, and for 3 days he would have extremely excruciating pain. I've seen him in 2 of those episodes. He looks worse than somebody with the kidney stones or a mother in a difficult labor. He would be screaming and jumping off the bed and everything, and everyone think that it's psychiatric. And then he would go on for another couple of weeks, be completely normal, and then have another 3 days. So he couldn't hold a job. He lost his insurance. When they took him into the emergency room, the only thing that would work would be huge doses of opiates. Of course, it just turns off the entire pain pathway. And so he goes in the emergency room, and they're like, oh, he's a drug addict. And he and his family are like, no, try to figure out what's wrong with him. He doesn't want the drugs. In 3 days, the pain will go away, and he's going to stop it. But he was labeled as a drug addict, and in one of the major metropolitan areas of the United States, not LA, but every single emergency room knew about him, and they wouldn't treat him. And so he was in that situation. We did the testing on him, found that he had 3 known mutations in a calcium channel. This is a calcium channel in which norepinephrine, or stress hormone, binds to the calcium channel, releases calcium into the cell, causes the neurons to turn up and turn on their mitochondria. The idea is that you see a tiger and you suddenly have to turn on your brain, your nervous system, and everything. You go into a fight or flight response. His mutations was causing a fight or flight response for even tiny amounts of norepinephrine. So every little problem that would go on with life would cause a fight or flight response in him. Put him on extremely high doses of propranolol, other parts of the therapy as well, particularly antioxidants, and the pain went away entirely. Like the first case, he went off the medication, it came back again, he went back on, he went back off again. So you can imagine, when you give a drug that's an expensive drug, and it's off-label, and these are way, way off-label. If you think about it, the first patient ever to have these conditions found. Insurance companies kept fighting it. They would lose the coverage, it would go off the drug, the thing would come back, and then eventually the first family chose to just pay for it out of their own pocket, and the second family is constantly fighting the insurance company. Let's see. Third case I wanted to go over, and it's still not on there, huh? Okay. This is a boy who had, he had some pain in the head and the abdomen, and his major problem was chronic pain. He had some other things as well, like encopresis, where he would be stooling his pants, and he had a bit of muscle weakness. But his main thing was he had chronic pain, and the pain that bothered him the most was in the eyes. He said like his eyes were on fire, or his own description, like someone would stab him with an ice pick in his eyes. And it was completely disabling. Ice pick migraines is a descriptive term which doesn't get you any further on that. Did testing in him and found that he had a mutation in the mitochondrial DNA, which is the mitochondria have their own DNA. It comes from the egg, not from the sperm, so everyone has exactly the same sequence as their mother and all their siblings and everything. There was a lot of chronic pain and other functional conditions in the matrilineage. He was put on a lot of mitochondrial targeted therapy, in particular coenzyme Q10, B vitamins like riboflavin, all at extremely high doses, and the pain went away. Of interest, his sister has the same mutation, of course, and in hers, she had complex regional pain syndrome in her ankle. She had, at one point, sprained her ankle. X-rays were normal, and then for 4 years thereafter had chronic pain in the ankle, and nothing would get rid of it. And they did scan after scan with an MRI, no one could find anything. Put her on antioxidants, and the pain went away entirely. I know no one else can see this, but just to remind you what I'm doing here. So one approach would be to sequence thousands and thousands of genes, and there are tests that Avantra, Cortigen, as well as other companies will do to look at all of the genes in the mitochondria, which is over 1,000, plus all the channelopathies, plus all the neurotransmitters, and some of the other ones that are involved in chronic pain. Particularly the sodium channels are a major cause of chronic pain. Those are the actual channels in which sodium rushes into a cell, which causes a nerve to fire in the pain neurons. What happens is that either A, those nerves twitch too much, the channels open up when they're not supposed to, or also even more commonly, once the channel opens, it takes a long time to close, and so that's sort of a cause of chronic pain. And there's certain medications which block these sodium channels. But in other words, if you know what the problem is in an individual patient, it's much easier to treat it. We also are coming up, because of it would be nice to be able to sequence thousands of genes in everyone, but not everyone has a PPO that will defer the cost of $10,000 of DNA sequencing and an expert to go through that and spend a huge amount of time. So we're also coming up with panels, including the Avantra Migraine panel, which is now available. I believe it's 365, 375, something like that, that will look at about 49 genes or so in the pain pathways, all of which are specifically treatable, including some of the ones that we just spoke about, sodium channels, calcium channels, many of the neurotransmitters, NMDA receptors, because NMDA glutamine receptors are treatable things, glycine, GABA receptors, ones involved in estrogen receptors, and with just a large amount of others. Pumps that pump ATP pumps that pump sodium back out, and many, many other causes. And the initial experience with these tests is that maybe, we're just starting those off, but from the ones that I've heard of, about 50% or so of patients that have significant migraine will find a variant that is treatable. And this is early in the process, and we do need to do more studies on this to see which kind of panels will be most likely to be treatable. But so this is an area which is rapidly growing, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of changes over the next couple of years. But the therapy is available today, and some of these tests do not cost a tremendous amount of money. All right.
In other words, there are drugs that dull your brain, that dull your senses, that stop pain, and there are other drugs that excite you, get you, and both are abused to a great extent, but I suspect they've both been around for thousands of years. Therefore, is there a reason why, is this a part of being human?
So the MDMA, what we think, and the reason people like to take MDMA out of the medical setting is that it makes people feel good. It's an empathogen, is another name for it, and it's a heart opener. So it makes people love themselves and love others, and the world is a beautiful place. It's not addictive, and that's really been looked at. And it's very different from addictions to opioids or alcohol, where those are drugs that people use to numb themselves. And there is a theory that most addiction, if you look at people with addictions, most of them, or many of them anyways, have a serious trauma history. And they're trying to numb themselves so they don't remember what happened to them. There's beautiful literature on that. And MDMA does the opposite. It helps you look at the trauma and not be re-triggered, and then you can move on. It's helpful for addictions.
Okay, we have a question over here, I believe, for Dr. McGeeney.
Should I stand up?
Yeah, if you
Oh, okay. Okay, this is difficult for me because I have suffered from anxiety and panic attacks, so just standing up is hard, but I'm figuring if I faint, someone will help me. I'm in the right room. I have a condition called temporal arteritis and polymyalgia, and I have been on prednisone for 4 years. It's doing a number on my body. 2 years ago, I went and got some CBD oil. I was afraid to try it. I'm from the generation that we never did marijuana, so it's scary for me. I found that there is nobody that can tell you what dosage you can take. I don't know where to go to do that. I go to the compassion centers. The compassion centers have young people that have limited knowledge, but I'm afraid. I don't know if CBD, maybe I need a little more THC. I want to get off prednisone. I got 2 phone calls from B&B medical marijuana doctors and from the Stanley Brothers in Colorado. Both told me to get off prednisone because it was a harsh drug before I went on CBD. If I get off prednisone, I can't walk.
Oh, okay.
And just one more thing. If prednisone is so harsh and you shouldn't use CBD or marijuana, then what is the cancer treatment that they let you have marijuana for?
First of all, thank you for that question. You were very clear, and it's a very important question. And I'm so glad you asked that. And you raised the issue of a number of issues in one, the issue of chronic prednisone. And before I answer it, I will say, be careful about taking medical advice on a treatment of your medical conditions from a non-physician who's telling you advice on what to do with your prednisone. Be careful about that. Now, you have a condition where one needs powerful anti-inflammatory agents, and the prednisone is powerfully dampening down your immune system. It so happens that one of the actions of the cannabinoids is as an anti-inflammatory. It's not something we initially think of, but it's true. It's true, but it doesn't mean it can take the place of high-dose prednisone. You have disorders which classically one uses high-dose prednisone every day. And I appreciate your reticence about using cannabidiol, CBD, but the chronic steroids are associated with potentially very significant side effects. You're quite right. But so are your untreated disorder. Terrible things can happen due to your untreated disorder, and you really need to be under the guidance of a physician who's familiar with both. To get to the issue of how much CBD, I suspect you will not be able to, if your condition really needs higher dose prednisone, you're not going to be able to come totally off. Maybe you're going to trim down a bit. To get to the dosing, I can give you some ballpoint numbers that, to give you an idea, say THC, the psychoactive, the most well-known psychoactive cannabinoid, about 10 milligrams will make people a little goofy. So like a high, so to speak. 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams in somebody naive will really do that. Whereas the CBD, in the paper I talked about in the New England Journal just 2 weeks ago as an anti-seizure agent, they were using 20 milligrams per kilogram. So they were using hundreds of milligrams, and it wasn't making people goofy. So you can, the good thing about it, if you have pure CBD, you can go up to hundreds of milligrams, but you come to a ceiling if you've got leakage of THC that starts to make you goofy, then you can't use that much. But the purer you have, the higher you can go. That I will tell you. Don't be worried about the dose. Be guided somehow by the person at the other end of the counter at the dispensary. You want to get it at a dispensary if possible because you have more assurance about the quality and reliability and dosing. So you need to be under the guidance of somebody as you bring the prednisone down. The prednisone is not all evil. It's there for a purpose. It may feel like golden handcuffs. I know I've talked a lot about that one question, but it's important. Work with your doctors. Please don't do it behind their back. They're only trying to help you, and it helps everybody that things are done up front. Is that answering your question?
It is answering my question, but the doctor that I work with, the medical doctor, did not say, he said it wouldn't hurt to go and to get your medical marijuana card. You go to a medical marijuana doctor, they just check your records. I had 32 pages of records, and then they send you out into the cannabis world and find what's good for you.
Yeah, you want to find something that's higher in CBD. The highest the better. And in Massachusetts, all dispensaries are vertically integrated, which means that you can only sell what you grow and prepare. I don't know if that's the case in Rhode Island, which kind of limits their choice at times. And the states feel that's safer and promotes less diversion. So you may be stuck with what your local dispensary happens to have. But I think I've given you a couple of pointers. I don't want to hog the time.
No, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I had a related question. Brian, I appreciate the thoroughness of your answer, and I think the question is one that is on, that type of question is one that's on a lot of people's minds these days. You raised the issue of reliability. What can we say about how trustworthy or reliable even things like concentrations of CBD oils, et cetera, are? Has anyone done anything like an analysis of 10 different centers to say whether that's even accurate information?
Yeah. You know, if you go, and I've never physically gone into a dispensary, and I'm not able to in Massachusetts without a medical marijuana card, but I am privy to their menu. And their menus, I think all the menus have a concentration lined up, so you know exactly for a plant or in the concentrates. It's all about concentrates these days. These are the liquid that you can inhale, vapor that's very soft in the lungs, if not smoke. And I'm not aware of who's doing quality control. You're asking who's doing quality control, and I will tell you that. I think there is an outside standardization, which I think in Massachusetts they have to abide by, and so they are. I think in order to get a dispensary license, you have to sign up to this oversight, this outside body lab testing. You know something about that, do you, sir? Okay. Gentleman probably knows more about that than I do. But would you agree in principle what my answer? Or?
Yeah, so every dispensary, everyone that's vertical integrator, they have to use outside lab testing in order to make sure that there's safety precautions for all the cannabis that they're selling or the medicine that they're selling. And that lab testing looks at pesticides and heavy metals, and it also looks at a small handful of the compounds that are in the medicine, such as THC levels or CBD levels, THCA and CBDA. So probably about 10 or 15 different compounds of the 140 plus compounds that are inside.
So at least that gives us some reassurance that...
It gives you some reassurance that you're buying a safer product that doesn't have heavy metal or pesticides in it. So, and that's an outside laboratory that does that. As far as consistency is concerned, that's where there's some discourse as far as if I bought my medicine last month and it was high CBD content called ACDC, or one of the Stanley, one of the CW, Charlotte's Web. You just don't know. There's high levels of variability in plants when it comes to genetics, and so one crop of medicine may be very different than the next crop of medicine. So it may not have the same number or level amount of compounds in there for that entourage effect. So you just have to, kind of, we genetically sequence cannabis as well, and that's why that's how you can actually tell consistency, whether one plant is the same as the next plant. So,
So hopefully the states are doing that, or forcing that on the dispensaries. I think Michelle has. Thank you, Chris.
I do have a question, but just really quickly, when you go into the dispensaries and you get your medicine, on the side of the bottles, much like a medication bottle, it will say the percentage of each different, of THC, of CBD, of all the different things. So even if it varies from month to month or crop to crop, you know based on those percentages what's in the cannabis that you're getting. But I had a question about the MDMA. I know that the MAPS study looked specifically at PTSD, but you mentioned that earlier in the 70s there had been some study on anxiety and addiction as well. Under the umbrella of anxiety, does MDMA seem like something that would be helpful for people who are living with something like obsessive compulsive disorder?
Yeah, there have been a few small studies. Certainly the hypothesis is yes, and the participant's description of how his life changed was someone who was treated for anxiety. So there's, I think, huge potential. There also is research being done at Johns Hopkins and NYU for people with end-of-life anxiety using psilocybin, and their results have also been impressive. So.
Okay, this will be our last
Yes.
question.
Hi. I have a son that suffers from pain-free migraines, the systemic vomiting and whatnot. Also suffers from epilepsy and Crohn's, onset around age 11. I just wondered if the treatment for headache migraines and the other forms of migraines is the same.
To some degree, it depends on what the underlying cause is. That in the family, you can have different types of migraine in different family members from the same molecular cause, the same gene. And you can have other things like irritable bowel and chronic fatigue from the same gene. And there are other genes and environmental components as well. It's actually very complicated. But many of the different genes will cause migraine and epilepsy, which are actually very closely related. So yeah, I mean, more than likely there are many of the risk factors, or many of the factors that are involved are across those different things. And that does give some idea, even without genetic testing, as to what genes might be involved, as what can do all of those at the same time. With testing, you can narrow it down a little bit more.
Well, thank you, everybody. This concludes the public portion of our program tonight. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful presentations and all the great questions that came out of the audience. So at this point, we're going to move on to the second phase.